Welcome back to the show, everybody. I am really glad that you are here. My guest today is Anouk Godbout. She is French, and so lives in Canada, speaks French. So we were having a whole conversation before we started recording about how to say things in French. So I will let her correct me if I did that so horribly. But she is a parent and supports other parents who have emotionally intense kids. And so I'm really excited for this conversation because I was an emotionally intense kid. And so we have a lot of really cool stuff to talk about together today. But it's interesting because it's from two different viewpoints. So, Anouk is coming from the parent viewpoint, and I'm coming from the former child viewpoint. But our perspectives and our message are very similar. So I'm really excited to jump into this conversation. So, Anouk, please tell us more about you and your life.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So I'm a mom of 3 kids that are all emotionally intense, 2 teenagers and a preschooler. And I basically live in a neurodivergent household. But it was I didn't know that was the case up until a year and a half ago when I started getting diagnoses for my older 2 kids. Although I always suspected my husband had ADHD or ADD. But yeah, the emotionally intense that's always been in my house. I just didn't know why, and I learned to deal with it anyway. And I like it can be neurodivergent, it can be other things. Sometimes it's not that. Sometimes it can be like anxiety, or it can be trauma, or other mental health issues, things like that. But there's a lot of reason for a child to be emotionally intense, and like we were talking a bit about before going on air. It's not kids that will have a tantrum once in a while because they're decide that they want their thing to go their way. It's kids that are losing it because they're not feeling good. And I think that's something, even not knowing, that I picked up on just intuitively when my kids were little. So yeah, and I also was raised my kids, and at least I tried, in the gentle parental way. No matter, I don't like to say a specific way. It's not one, I would not name someone in particular, but just in that field, and I think that was helpful too. But yeah, I've basically been in a neurodivergent household and dealt with that intensity, and I'm quite sensitive. I'm not sure I would say highly sensitive, in specifically, but in that spectrum of things. So sometimes that was very overwhelming for me as a parent. So I had a very hard time in the beginning. I also tried to be the perfect mom, do everything. At some point, I was doing my master's degree, and I was on the board of 5 different nonprofits, and I was working, and I had my 2 children, and that was just too much. So yeah, I come from losing it as a parent a lot, and finding that very hard. And at some point, I had no choice but to switch things around, basically, because I was burning completely down, burning out completely. And I would say I kind of have a sister who was quite intense too. So that was helpful, because often I would think of how my parents were dealing with her, because she's 6 years younger than me. So I did remember some of her big crisis. I do have a different neurodivergence that makes it difficult for me to remember stuff. I have aphantasia, and another one that I just don't remember. I never remember exactly how it's called, but it's like a memory of the memory of what happened to me is very, very thin. I don't remember much. And aphantasia is not being able to see things in my head. So I don't have any visual memory of anything. And so I don't have lots of memory of my childhood. But the ones I have are from the very intense emotional ones. And some of them were the crisis, like big intensity from my sister. So I used some of that with my own, especially my older one, that were quite, that he's similar to how my sister was. So yeah, that was not very clear, but
No, that was a lot of really helpful information that gives us a great understanding of your background and your family and where you're coming from. And I think I don't have memories of my childhood before I was about 14. And the ones so I know a lot about my life from the stories that my family has told.
yes.
But they're not my actual memories, right?
Yeah,
They're
that are
just,
pictures that we
yes,
saw. Yeah,
yes,
I'm a big photographer for that reason, because the only memories I have are from pictures. Like I can even tie each of my memory to the photos in my book, like photo book from my childhood. So yeah, so I don't know if you looked up aphantasia, or the other one. I will have to look it up, but it's like autobiographical memory deficit or something like that. I never remember exactly what it is. I just recently realized that's why I had no memory.
yeah. That's interesting. I also, because I have ADHD, my perception of time is
Yeah.
pretty, I don't want to say warped, but I I have a very difficult time with the concept of when things happened in history. So I don't know. I can remember that something happened, but I can't tell you if it was 3 months ago or 3 years ago,
Mhm.
unless I have some kind of context around it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I have a lot of things like that that I cannot place things in the past. I can't tell you how long ago that thing happened.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, my memory is weird for a lot of the same reasons. Um, I oh, hang on, I just lost my train of thought. It won't. I'm sure it won't be the last time.
That's okay. I'm used to that.
I one of the things that I want to share is I don't know that I've ever talked about this before, but several months ago, I'm going to say several months ago, with the disclaimer that it could have been like 2 years ago. I saw
That's
somebody.
still several months. Several months
Yeah,
doesn't
you're
mean
right. Several has no quantity.
no.
I saw I'm on this list of when reporters are looking for someone to interview about a story and they throw out,
Like
their story ideas.
arrow or something.
Yes, yes. So somebody asked how the question for the article or whatever it is they were publishing was, how do you know when your child is intentionally manipulating you?
Mm.
And my immediate gut reaction to that was, it was interesting because it was twofold. My first thought was, children are not intentionally manipulating anybody. We are responding to our environment. We're trying to get our needs met. We're like, the things that we do are not about you. It is us responding to our environment and trying to get our needs met. And so that was my first immediate reaction to just reading that headline. And then my second reaction was like kind of the opposite. And it was that all behavior is manipulation, but not in the way that we connotate that
Yeah.
word, right?
Yeah.
Not in a negative, but everything that we do as human beings is to try to get our needs met.
Yeah,
And
sure.
so because of that, all behavior is manipulation,
Yeah,
but
makes sense.
it's not intentional and it's not vindictive and it's not
Yeah.
mean spirited, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
And that's the way that we generally see, like they want to get back at you, like they want to
yes,
have their way,
they're
and like
pushing my buttons. Yeah.
yeah, it's a win-lose situation in general that we see it that way.
Yes, yeah, that's a great way to clarify that. And I think along with that, So I didn't end up submitting anything for it because I thought I'm like way too emotional about this topic to even, have a conversation about it. But it just kind of reinforced for me, even so my background is in behavior in, the public school system. And one of the concepts is that every behavior serves a purpose, and the main purposes are attention seeking, avoidance, or to get a tangible object, right? To get something. So those are, and then one is also sensory, but those are the basically the theory is that all behavior falls under that somewhere. It's either the kiddo's trying to get attention, they're trying to avoid something, like usually a task or a demand. They're trying to get something physical, or a sensory. And I remember looking at my own behavior as an adult, and the example that kept coming to my mind was that when I was married, there was an engagement that we had almost every week. It was very predictable. It was this thing. It was, and there were aspects of this occurrence that made it really awkward and uncomfortable for me. And so I did not like attending this thing that we attended. But it happened almost, it's very predictable. And almost every time when it was time to go, I would just get really upset, and I would excuse myself, and I would go sit in the bathroom for a bit, and I would just be upset, and I would, kind of shut down. I didn't want to talk about it. But then I would look at that through that context and that filter, and I would say, I'm not trying to get attention. I actually want to be left alone. I'm not trying to get anybody's attention. I'm not trying to avoid the situation, because I know that, like, I'm not avoiding the situation. We are going to this thing. I'm not avoiding it by doing what I'm doing. I'm not trying to get anything physical. There's nothing to be had. And it's like, it's not sensory. I'm just having a reaction to what's happening in my environment. And so that really caused me to challenge the traditional structure around why we behave the way we behave. And I started looking for other examples of, sometimes we're just having a reaction to something in our environment. We're not trying to get anything. We're not trying to get out of anything. We're just having a response to the situation that we're in. It could be like, if you start crying about something, it doesn't mean you want anybody's attention. It doesn't mean you're trying to get out of something. You're just having
Reacting.
a response to something that's happening. And so that really caused me, I know this is a really long story, but that my point is, it really caused me to rethink the whole idea of every behavior having to have a purpose, because I don't know that they do. I think sometimes it's just us trying to come to terms with a situation.
Yeah, makes sense. It's a bit like, I guess that can be avoidance, but like every physical reaction, like headaches or tummy aches that we can have when we are not feeling good in a situation. Or I remember I was the first of my friends to get a driver's license, and I was kind of used for that reason. Like, people wanted to go every places, and I was kind of the person to go to. And sometimes I would say yes because I was a people pleaser, and then I would get a neck ache, like so bad that I could not turn my head, and so I could not drive. So that would be kind of an avoidance thing, but at the same time, it was just like reacting. It was not like I wanted really to avoid it, because I had planned to go, I accepted to go, but like physically I was reacting to the stress basically of going, and I was like a new driver, so that was stressing me out too. So I agree that sometimes there's not always a specific reason and a specific purpose with where the behaviors. But at the same time, I think there's always a reason why. There's always something behind why we're reacting that way. Like, there was a reason. The example you're giving, you were triggered for XYZ reasons, and you wanted to Like you were not feeling good by going there. So there was a reason for sure. There was an explanation for the behavior. I think that's what we always need to look at. It's not necessarily like, and like it's just why this is happening, and not necessarily what for, you know. That's what's the goal of that action or behavior, just what's the reason. And I think that's much more useful to look at the why and what's triggering that reaction. Is it stress? Is it sensory overload? Is it perfectionism? Is it distractibility? Is it like, it can be lots of things, but looking at why things are like kids are behaving the way they're behaving, I think it's much more useful to why they're, because most of the time they're not consciously, even if it's for avoiding or getting, they're not consciously doing it. And that's where we have the line between manipulation and like manipulating, because yes, they're manipulating their environment by behaving in some way, but they don't do it consciously with a purpose and a goal.
Yes.
They're
There's
just
not intentionality.
no, there's no, like, they're not saying I'm going to make a tantrum on the floor right now so my mom feel guilty and she's gonna let me have that. No, it's just I want to have that thing so bad that I lose control.
Yeah.
They don't think through what's gonna happen and why. They just lose control.
Yeah.
Don't do it for like, and I my youngest, I often tell her, like, when she start yelling at me first because she wants something, I'm like, do I ever give you things because you yell? And she's like, no. Then why are you doing it? But I know she's not doing it on purpose, just to help her come back to calming down. And like, what do you want? Because often the demand is not even clear because she's yelling. So it's like, what do you want? Can you express it for me so I get what you want? And sometimes it's going to be a no still.
Right.
But yelling at me is not going to get you what you want more, you know? So, but I know she's not yelling at me because she thinks she's going to get it, because she's not getting it because she's
It's not
yelling.
about you.
No, it's
Right.
just because she's losing, she's
Right.
frustrated, and so she cannot control that reaction at all.
Right. Right. Yeah. She's not trying to manipulate your response. She's just reacting the
Yeah.
only way that she's capable of at that moment.
Yeah, exactly. She's just reacting to what's happening inside of her, not even that much what happening outside. I'm setting a boundary, and the boundary is frustrating her, and she's exploding out of that frustration. It's not even the boundary itself; it's the inside reaction to the boundary that's making her react that way. So it's not. So yeah, I think it's much more useful to look at it as why, what's the cause of it, what's happening, what's the trigger. And not
what we're trying to get out of it.
Exactly.
And yeah, I think a great addition to that point too is that you know, when we talk about, sometimes you can distinguish a tantrum and a meltdown, right? A tantrum tends to be intentional and you know, for a purpose. If you notice that even if the behavior does get your kiddo out of the expectation, or it does get them what they wanted, but they still don't stop the meltdown, right?
It's
That's when you know, they're not doing this to get anything. They're doing this because they can't help it.
Definitely. And even the tantrum, like, often we think of like 2 years old toddler tantrum. They're not doing that to get anything. They're doing that because they're like, they just don't have the skills to do what they want to do by themselves. It's more than not. That's why, like, how many tantrum you can get from a kid that want to tie their own shoe but cannot do it yet because they don't have the the skills. So it's often that it's coming from a frustration much more than anything else. And so it looks like trying to manipulate, but I think it looks like that because we give in a lot of in that. And I'm not saying that with any negative or positive thing attached. Like, it's okay sometimes to give in to those things, especially when it's a meltdown and a kid is just losing it. Because anyway, like, that kid who had a very bad day at school is coming back, because like there was too much demand for that child on that day for whatever reason. He might be bullied, and he might have like sensory overload, and he's at home and he's asking for a popsicle and you say no, and the child melting down. The popsicle is just the excuse to melt down. It's not the real reason.
It's the
So
final straw.
yes. So like, even if you decide to give the popsicle because you realize that that was just the drop too much for that child that day, it's not going to have bad impact on the long term, because the child knows he's not, and he might not even remember what happened. Lots of the times when they're in that state, if they, once they're calm, if they ask them, you ask them to recap what happened, they're not able to, because they were in such a state of disorganization that were not really conscious of what was happening. So it's not going to have a lasting effect. It's not like a child who's completely in control and saying like, I want a popsicle, and like stomping there. So that's more like a child who's just trying to have their way because they're in control. It looks really different.
Yeah, yeah. And tell me, what are some of your top strategies, suggestions, recommendations that you really love to share with parents who are in the midst of this, right? Who are trying their best to support their emotionally intense kiddos?
So I would say the first would be what we were talking about. I call it playing detective, and it's really finding what's the trigger, and doing that in any way you can. I love observing, and like you can use a journal, or I personally love my camera to do that. I take pictures of everything, and just observing who the kid is and what's triggering them. And it's a very hard job to do that, because often there's more than one thing, and if the kids goes to daycare or school, we don't know everything that happened that day, so we cannot really know, and lots of those kids are not going to tell you what happened in their day. So it can be very challenging, and we might not be able to find them all, but we will. Often parents feel like there's no pattern and the kids can blow out at anything. Most of the time it's for that the reason I was like the example of the popsicle is just because that was the thing too much, But if we can find the different things, at some point we see patterns. It can take times, but we see pattern and think that can be the most triggering. And the other things that we said, I would say it's us being able to stay calm and stay in that calm state. And this is like, I always hate when people say, like, don't yell at your kids or stay calm. That's the worst advice, because it's not doable. Like, just that way, it's just not doable. And to be able to do that, we need ourselves to be regulated, to be calm. And that's not something you can do in the moment. When the child loses it, we cannot say, I'm going to stay calm. No, because often it's triggering our own defense mechanism, our own fight or flight or fawn or like free response, because they're really intense and it's physically threatening. And sometimes it's even like they can even be violent. So it really is physically threatening. So it's going against that instinct of protecting ourselves. And often that's why we yell, and that's why we lose it. And
we become afraid, we become anxious, we become
and sometimes
anger is like a mask for other things. So even if we think we're angry, we're afraid or we're scared or
and often we're scared of 1,000 things at the same time, because we have the mind that the kids are just in the moment feeling bad, but we can also be like, if my child behaved that way now, how it's going to be at Christmas, or how it's going to be at school, or are they ever going to be able to be an adult? Like we can spin, and it's not conscious. It goes so fast, but we spin in that and in that worry, and it makes us lose it. And add to that the fact that we have our own day. Like we might have had some problem at work or with other people in our life during the day, and we might already be overwhelmed, tired. And if like lots of those kids, especially neurodivergent kids, might have neurodivergent parents. They can also be easily triggered and more more easily like have some sensory issues that are coming into play also. So it can go very fast in not being regulated ourselves. And
Right.
that's true for neurodivergent parent, but it's true for every parent. We can easily be dysregulated, and we're kind of trained ourselves not to realize that we are. Like we were trying to, like we don't realize at what point we are dysregulated. We kind of numb it at the end of the day and forget that we are dysregulated, and then we explode. That's because we are dysregulated. And so the classic example is to do self-care, which is also something that like we hear a lot and always, and it feels often inaccessible as parents and not realistic, especially when we have kids that can be very demanding. And that's how I always say, like, even if you just take one deep breath an hour, it's better than nothing. Like you don't have to go for a weekend at the spa, because that's not realistic when you have kids most of the time. If you can go, that's great. But for lots of parents, having time alone without the kids is not necessarily a reality. I always encourage parents to try and do it at least a little bit, but a little bit can really be like a minute while your child is in the other room doing something else, and starting small, because often it's just not what we see as being self-care is often not realistic in our life. So switching that expectation and trying to focus also on things that are regulating. So like yoga, mindfulness in any way, deep breathing, meditation, even if it's for 1 minute of yoga a day, it's better than none. And deep breathing, just like when you are able to take one warm sip of your drink, warm drink, before you put it in the microwave for the 10 times, like, and just enjoying that sip because it's warm for once. Just that can make a difference at the end of the day, which we do it a lot. And finding moments also with the kids. So I suggest, like, what I love the most is dance party. It's easy, it's really freeing, because with your child, like, you don't care how you looks. And I would say even more when you have teen, the more silly you can look, the funniest it is, because they look ashamed, and it's funnier as long as they don't have friends all in. But yeah, I like doing things like that. For me, photography was a big thing. Like, I'm photographing my kids in a way that I'm not asking them to do anything or smiling or looking at me. I'm just following them around and taking photos of what they're doing. And so I will engage with them with my camera, because I will ask question and turn around to find different angles and things like that. So it's a hobby for me. It's also a way to connect with them and to really be focused on just what's happening right now.
Yeah.
So it can be anything that works for us. Like, I was talking to someone and she said, I love gardening, so I bring my kids with me to garden. Like, that's a good example. You can go in the garden and garden together, set a place where the kids can mud and maroon everything. So you have your own space that might live at some point. But it's just finding those ways of ourselves staying regulated. And being in nature is a very easy one with kids. It will help them. And it's also teaching them self-care without necessarily like explaining what you're doing, but just doing it with them is a way to say, like, today I'm gonna do that. And yes, like right now, I tell my youngest, I do yoga in the morning, and you'll have to wait for me to take care of you. Like, you're gonna go down and eat your breakfast. Your dad's gonna give you breakfast. And you can all like organize breakfast the day before so they can eat by themselves if they're like able to do that. There's ways to do it, even if like it's not easy. And we tend to forget ourselves as parents very, very easily. But I did that for years and it was not working. I'm a recovering yeller. I was yelling a lot with my kids because I was losing it all the time. And I tried all the tips that I could find on Pinterest it was not working. And really, the only thing that really worked for me was self-care and building it small and step by step, and having it in my day in a way that fits my needs. And that's different for everybody. Um,
Yeah.
for some people, it's routine, but for lots of ADHD, it's the opposite. You need to do it in a way that feel exciting. And so it's just doing like the right way to do self-care that fills your cup.
Yeah. Yeah. It's um going back to what you had said earlier about how as adults we have our own triggers and our own
Mhm.
possible traumas and that kind of thing. It's interesting because I've been doing what I do to some capacity for almost 20 years now. So public school teacher, behavior specialist, running my business. I can tolerate almost anything. Most things don't even faze me, like kids cursing. I've been peed on. Like I,
Yeah, been there.
yeah, I've been
Puked
grabbed
on.
in really inappropriate places. I've been, bitten and hit and kicked and farted on. I mean, most things don't really faze me, but the two things that will really, really shut me down is kids yelling and kids slamming doors. And it's not because those were part of a traumatic past for me. I actually don't have any connection to that in terms of my past. It's because I am so sensitive to loud noises and I have a very primitive startle reflex.
Yeah.
And so when people start yelling, I have to work really hard to maintain my sanity,
Mhm.
because it's such an assault to my brain when people are yelling. And the same with like slamming doors. I mean, anything that's a loud, unexpected noise, it
Mhm.
really shocks my system. Um, and even, when I had Starfish in person, the kids can get really loud because they're just they're playing, they're being silly, they're
Yes.
whatever. But it can get really, when we've got 15 kids there, it can get really
Mhm.
loud. And so a lot of evenings when I leave, sometimes I'll just sit there for a while, just sit in the silence until I feel more regulated. Sometimes I'll drive home in the silence.
Mhm.
Often when I come home, I'll just go for a walk, and it's nighttime when I get home. I just go for a walk for an hour in my neighborhood because the noise factor is very dysregulating for me.
Mhm.
I don't do well in I'm an introvert. I don't like crowds. I just don't do well with all of that stimulation. Um, and so I think that's an important point, is just recognizing what are things that, even if you take your kids out of the equation, if anybody does
Yeah.
this thing,
Yeah.
right, that it's a challenge for you. It could be sensory, it could be trauma, it could be whatever. And for me, it's yelling and slamming doors. Those are the two things that shut me down. You can pee on me, you can, like you can call me every day, but none of those other things faze me. But I physically cannot
Mhm.
tolerate people yelling and slamming doors.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think it's really important to just be aware of that. And then what do you do when those things do happen? What do I do when I've been at Starfish for 3 hours and the kids have just been really rowdy? Like I said, my practice is to just sit in the silence for a while,
Yeah.
or to go for a walk and just get noise out of my head, you
Mhm.
know.
And I think that's a very well, like, to find what's triggering for us.
Mhm.
It's easier than to find the right self-care to do, because we, like, that for you, this is regulating, like the silence is regulating because the trigger is noise. And
Mhm.
so for other people, it can be the opposite. Like, I know my husband is highly social and I am extrovert, and at some point he was studying and lots of at home, and he was getting dysregulated because he was not seeing enough people and having like chatting with enough people.
Mhm.
I'm also an introvert, so I have trouble fathoming that idea. But for him, that was like, I had to tell him, like, go out, go see people, go get a side job where you see people on an everyday basis, because you need that. And that's very different for him. And so I think that's where we really need to decide what's helping us. Like, seeing one friend for me can be self-care, seeing 3 friends, not self-care. Like, it's too many people. So like but for others, it's going to a party is a form of self-care. I mean, for me, that's a trigger. There's too many people. Yeah, it's definitely overwhelming. And so I think it really is the same as for our kids. Our triggers, finding them and then finding what's regulating. And for the kids is the same. Once you find a trigger, it's finding what helps them regulate and helps them calm down. And so we don't get to those, and we will still get there. Like, the kids that are intense, they're still going to be intense. They will still get there sometimes, but maybe less intense or less often. That's the goal. I'm never going to say that we're not going to have any of those reactions. Because that's just not life. And often we don't control like you were saying, like, you're an adult, you're in this situation for 3 hours, you know what's triggering you, but you still are, so you're able to control yourself. And also it can be masking for neurodiversity, but it can also just be for any adults, any kids that are a bit older. We do better in social settings than we do in private. Most of the time when we like meltdown, it's at home in a safe space where we know people are not going to judge because we're melting down. Some of our kids are not able to do that, or not yet, but adults in general, and some adults cannot do it yet. But most adults or teens are able to do that, to give the impression to the outside world that they're okay, so they can control to some extent. And it can look like they're in control for that reason, but they need to let that out at some point. Otherwise, it's not gonna work.
Yeah. I think, man, I keep losing my train of thought today. This is actually a great example. This is my third podcast today. And so the lights get to me, the sound, like I get tired voice, like this is a great example. This is my lesson to not have so many.
I have 3 recordings as a guest today, which is like, because we had to, like, I moved hours today and I already had 2, and it was like, that might be a bit intense. I'll see for the next one how it is, but
yeah, I really like doing the interviews, but I find it's taxing on my brain.
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
Yeah, so I really enjoy doing them, but I find I become less coherent.
Yeah.
As the day goes on.
Yeah, I hear people saying that I record like an entire day of podcasts. I'm like, how can you even do that?
So one of the things I was gonna say is, one thing that I have found that works really well, and this really applies to pretty much anything, but specifically when we're talking about calming and regulating and that kind of thing. As we all know, the phrase calm down, right, is like, it's probably the most inciting phrase, right? Nowhere in the history of the world has that phrase ever been successful. But
we still use it all the time, though.
Right. Yeah, those 2 words should not be allowed to go together. One of the things that I do, one of my goals is always to just be as non-confrontational as possible. And whether I'm helping a child with emotional regulation, whether we're talking about social stuff, whatever the case may be, I always want to be as non-confrontational as possible, because my goal is to help. And we are not perceived as being helpful when it's a confrontational situation.
For sure.
So less than a week ago, I was working with a kiddo one-on-one, and there were some outside factors that were going on during our session, and he got really emotional and started crying, which in the time that I've known him, had not seen from him. But it was very clear that he was just really overwhelmed with the emotions that he was feeling. And then he started, making comments and saying things that really helped me see that he was really upset, and it wasn't anything I had said or done. There were other factors happening that were kind of interfering, honestly, with our ability to do our thing. And so what I started doing, I removed the other stuff that was happening, and I just started talking myself through the situation and talking about what I like to do when I'm feeling upset. And this is one of my favorite strategies, because I'm at no point am I telling anybody what to do or what I think they should do. I'm not even making suggestions. I'm just saying what I'm going to do right now. And so once I had removed the outside factors, I just started taking deep breaths. And so I said, when I'm feeling upset, taking deep breaths really helps me, feel less upset. And so then I was practicing taking deep breaths. And then I said, when I'm feeling upset, the things that really help me feel better are listening to some of my favorite songs, going for a walk, because I really like being outside and I like exercising. And sometimes I just need to take a nap. Sometimes I just need to go to sleep. And so I'm talking to myself out loud, basically, is what I'm doing, but I'm sharing my practices, right? And so after a few minutes, I asked him, what are some things that help you feel better when you're feeling upset? And I don't remember what he said, but he had a couple things that he said. And now we're having a conversation, right? So now I've gotten him to shift from the emotional part of his brain to the logical part of his brain, because now we're having an actual conversation, which you can't do when somebody's, in the emotional part of their brain. But then we were able to start talking about what is there anything that you can do right now that might help you feel better? So again, I intentionally kept my voice volume really low, my tone really neutral. But I just started by talking about, because I actually I was frustrated by what was happening that was causing him to feel the way he was feeling, that I had very little control over. So I also was feeling upset myself, to be real about it, because I was frustrated at what was happening. But point being that was a really successful strategy, was for me to just talk about how I was feeling and what I was doing about it. I also shared, I said, one of the things I try to remind myself when I don't feel well is, do I want to keep feeling this way? Do I want to keep feeling frustrated, annoyed, angry, whatever? And most of the time the answer is no. So then I have to do something to feel differently, right? I have to do something differently in order to feel differently. So that was part of the conversation too. I'm just putting a little bit of logic in there. But again, I'm not talking about him. At no point was I talking about him. I was talking about me. And it makes kids a lot more receptive to the conversation when it's not about, what can you do right now? Anything that we target toward them, they're just automatically going to be less receptive. But if we can make it about us, and if we can make it a very empathetic situation, then I find that to be really successful.
Yeah. And I would say, like, it's also a bit like, I use this with parents in a different way, because I find we often use you when we talk to parents, like, you need to do something. And I've always used us, like us as parents. And the us it leaves people the choice to decide if they are part of that us or not, because they might not. It's not because others are that you are also, like, you can choose to be part of that or not. So it gives us some power to decide if we are part of that thing or not. So yeah, I think that's also the same kind of ways, like, it's giving the other person power in the situation, and like it's really like, it's freeing to be given that space to decide if you want to engage. Like, he could have decided not to engage, he didn't add like to do it, really. And so
Right.
that, I think that's helpful. I did something similar. It's fun because I did something similar with my son recently. Like he was very upset in a day, and I was like, when I don't go to bed and I don't sleep enough, I'm on edge and
Mhm.
I don't have any patience. So just putting that out there.
Right. Right. It's
The
like
same if I
building
don't
that
eat.
commonality, right?
Yeah, or if I
You
don't
know,
eat,
like,
I can get on it. I know that's one
yeah.
of my big trigger. If I'm hungry, it's I can, like, I don't have any patience. Like the angry or hungry, I don't even know how we pronounce that. Like the combination of angry and hungry, like that really is me. I mean, I get that very fast. So I know this is one of my trigger. And like my son was like, I haven't eaten for a while, and was like, can that be why you're not patient? Like I know it's for me. Can
Mhm.
it be for you? It might not be, but it's just more opening the possibility of what might be happening instead of saying you haven't eaten, that's why you are,
Right.
which we don't know
It's
totally.
disempowering, right? When we
Definitely.
try to tell somebody what they're thinking or how they're feeling. Yeah.
Yeah, because we don't really know. But at the same time, it's also hard because when they're little, we're told that we need to help them name or recognize the emotion by telling them, which is not bad advice. It also is a way when our kids can learn what they're feeling. But we cannot say you're feeling that. It's you might be feeling that, especially when they're growing older and they have more
Mhm.
knowledge and understanding of what's happening in their own body. It's very hard to be told you're feeling that, because
Mhm.
that might not be the case. It's our
Right.
interpretation from the outside.
Yeah. Yeah. Another thing that I always try to do when a kiddo shares something about how and a lot of our kids don't have a filter, right? And so they'll say things that again, to somebody, I don't get my feelings hurt really. But for example, this same kiddo, the first time I met him, when he came to see me for one-on-one support, I said, "Hey, I'm really glad that you're here." And he said, "I'm just waiting for this to be over."
Oh.
But to me, I just said, "Yeah, I feel that way sometimes too."
Mm.
Or I can say, "I totally understand that." Right? I mean, like, it doesn't bother me that he said that. Like,
No, and
I'm
it's not
glad that,
personal to you. It's just
right.
he had bad experiences and with stuff like that in the past, and so he's not feeling good right now with that. But
Yeah.
you might be able to turn things around because he might feel better at some point with you. But we often take things personally, for sure.
Yeah. And even, sometimes when I have the in-person program, kids are like, "I don't really want to be here today." And I always say, sometimes I feel that way too.
Mhm.
Sometimes I wish I could just stay home. You know what I mean? Because it's real. That's the
Yeah,
truth.
we're all that way sometimes.
Right. And so I always try to validate when somebody tells me how they're feeling, even if it's not quote unquote socially appropriate. I don't care, right? I always try to validate when somebody's telling me how they feel. And, there's, I don't know that there's ever been a time that somebody's told me something that I couldn't relate
It's
to.
it's rare, honestly. Like if you take the time, in general, we can relate to lots of things. We just have to try.
Yeah.
There's so many things there that are just socially construct, and the same with parenting expectations. Like we expect parents to do XYZ socially for no reason at all other than looking like a good parent. And like I always say, we're never going to look like a good parent no matter what happens. There's always going to be someone judging, so it's just pointless. Just stop trying.
Yeah, what works. So here's my take on um parenting, teaching, whatever. I don't believe in the concepts of right or wrong or good or bad. Unless
Mhm.
you're physically harming your child, right? Stop
Yeah,
doing
sure.
that immediately. But in general, I don't believe that I do things better than somebody else, or that, I'm doing things the right way and you're doing things the wrong way. I just don't believe in that. I do believe that everything that we say and do has a natural consequence, and we can recognize that we're not getting the consequence we were trying to get.
Hmm.
And so that's all that it means. I tend to be really good at getting the social consequences I'm trying to get from my kids, but it's because I know what strategies lead to those consequences, right? And so it's just a matter, it's not that I'm doing something right and you're doing it wrong. It's just that I know what to do to get the outcome that I'm looking for. And so that's how I see it. It's just whatever you're doing isn't wrong or bad. It's just not getting you to the outcome that you're trying to get to. And it's the same with the kids, right? Yelling when somebody, tells you no isn't wrong or bad, but it's also not getting you
What
what
you
you're
want.
trying to get to, right? And so because of that, we might want to consider trying something different that is more likely to get you what you want,
That makes sense, totally. Yeah.
Okay, Anouk, is there anything else that you would like to share for parents before we go today?
No, I think we've shared plenty already.
Been a great conversation, huh?
Really, really.
I want to share one more thing, actually. I try to say this as often as I can, but it's probably not often enough. Just to give a little bit of context for my childhood, again, I don't have memories before I was 14, but from what I know, when I was 4, I was really challenging, was physically aggressive, lots of meltdowns. I was eloping. I was told I would even try to get out of the car, as we were driving. It sounds like I had a strong aversion to putting shoes on. And so anytime we had to go somewhere and I had to put shoes on, I would have a meltdown. I would try to get out of the car. I was basically trying to get out of this
The
situation.
shoes.
Yes. And I also think there was something about going places I didn't want to go. That seems to be a theme also. If I didn't want to go somewhere, I did not want to go there. So again, I was too young to really have an understanding of that. And then again, when I was 14, basically my entire high school life, I was very defiant and difficult at home, just very much so. And so that's the context for my childhood. And so I just want to reiterate, what we've said before, that it was all about me. It wasn't about a person. It was about my own needs and what I was going through and what I was feeling and how dysregulated I was. I also want to share that almost every time I talk to somebody who raised an emotionally intense kiddo, by the time they get to be an adult, they're pretty darn successful.
Yes.
And so I just want to put that out there because I think
we just need to get them there alive, basically.
Yeah. And part of it, to be honest, is I think when I'm saying we as emotionally intense kiddos, neurodivergent, whatever, I think we just really struggle in artificial contrived environments. And the school system is a very artificial contrived environment. Traditional parenting models are very artificial and contrived. And so I think a lot of kids struggle in school because it's such an artificial environment. Kids struggle at home because parents are trying to parent them in traditional ways. And so once kiddos move out of those systems, we will be okay. I think we will be okay. We will go on and do amazing things. So I just want to share that ray of hope for parents, that yes, 18 years is a long time.
But there's hope for sure.
Yes.
There's hope.
I really, I've talked a lot lately to parents whose kids are older now, and or sometimes it's parents who've removed their kids from the school system, right? Sometimes it's parents who have learned different ways to parent. So whatever the case may be, but I just find that when we are out of those traditional systems and environments and we can find our own way, that we really flourish and shine. But I also think it's important for parents to let their kids find their own way. I think
for them in doing that, then finding things that work for them, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Anouk, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. This was a really awesome conversation. And thank you for everything that you are doing to support parents of emotionally intense kiddos. It is definitely, I'm sure it's a very isolating feeling. It's probably a lot of stigma,
Yes,
when we have
definitely.
kiddos that are emotionally intense. So thank you for being there to support families. And please, where can we find you online?
My website is familymoments.ca because I'm in Canada. And I also on Instagram, it's in French, so it's a bit harder, but the link to my Instagram is like mama.famille, which is the same as Family Moments, but in French. Moments is spelled exactly the same. And I also have a podcast, which is Parenting the Intensity. I have an Instagram account for it too. So, and I do have like a free resources to help parents get started in parenting in their own way, the way they support their own kids, like we've been talking. If they want to check in a self-care guide also, that is free on my website. So they can go check that out if it's something they want more support with.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Nick, I'm glad that you are here. And to everybody listening, I'm really glad that you are here as well. And I'll
Thank
see you
you very much.
next week.
Thank you.